Hi everyone, welcome back to Government 2305. Today we will be discussing the executive branch of the federal government. So if you are all ready, let's get started. So first of all, here is an illustration that shows us all of the past presidents, including President Trump. If you can see this graphic, it starts with George Washington, goes all the way through. You see the photographs of all of the presidents. You also note that all of the presidents, of course, have been men. This does not mean that women have not run before. Of course, we know Hillary Clinton ran. During this last election cycle, there were a number of women running for the presidency. We hope that in the next few elections, in the next few cycles, we will have a woman president. You just don't ever know, right? We have seen our first black president. Now we are looking for our first female president, regardless of race. If you take a note, everybody up until President Obama was a white male. That is not, of course, a requirement to be president, but it seems to be the trend. So let's hope that here in the future, soon, we will have another president of color, regardless of whether it's a man or a woman. So the Constitution is where we will find presidential power. The presidential power is rooted in the Constitution, as the Constitution is what has established the executive branch. So what we will find is that Article 2, Section 1 establishes a unitary executive. So what does this mean? Well, what unitary means is that we have this Constitution that has established that the power is vested in one person, the president. So the president is considered a unitary executive. Then, Section 1 establishes an electoral college. The electoral college was to limit the presidency's power. The idea was to have an indirect election to establish a Republican form of government with a strong executive who was then responsible to the state legislators instead of the people. However, the presidency strengthened with the development of the National Convention system. It was the National Convention system where we now started nominating presidential candidates. Because it gave the presidency independence from Congress, and also because it is a mass popular base. If you will recall, in the summer of 2020, prior to the November elections, both the Republicans and the Democratic Party had conventions, virtually though, in 2020 of course, and each state then was represented, and each state cast their vote for both Democratic and Republican nominees for the presidency. It is these conventions that replaced caucuses. The caucuses, of course, being those closed meetings of party leaders who were selected to choose the candidates and plan strategy. Sections 2 and 3 of Article 2, though, outline the presidential powers and duties. Now, these powers and duties include expressed, delegated, and inherent powers. Express powers are those specific powers granted to the president under Article 2 of the Constitution. Delegated powers are those powers that are then passed on to the president by Congress. Inherent powers are powers that flow from the nature of the executive authority and are most associated with leadership during a time of crisis. Now, presidential powers, we'll go ahead and speak more about each of the three types of powers in some more detail. To start off with, delegated powers. Now, as I mentioned in the previous slide, delegated powers come from Congress. Over the last 3/4 of a century, Congress has voluntarily given a great deal of power to the president and the executive branch. Now, Congress cannot implement the laws that they make, so it must rely on the executive branch to do so, as the executive branch carries out congressional legislation. Its agencies develop thousands of rules, regulations, orders, and findings at their own discretion. This is a result of congressional legislation often not being very detailed. Now, since the New Deal, this is during the administration of Franklin Roosevelt, Congress has given executive agencies broad mandates, drafting legislation, offering clear standards and guidelines for executive implementation. Remember, Congress writes the laws, but then it is up to the executive branch to implement them. So this is where we see delegated powers, right? These are the powers that come from Congress. Now, inherent powers. Presidents claim that there is a third source of power beyond express and delegated powers. These powers are not expressed in the Constitution, but they can be inferred from the fact that they stem from the rights, duties, and obligations of the presidency. So presidents say that this third source of power is just a part of the job. It comes with the office. Now, express powers. Now, these are the powers that are spelled out in the Constitution. They come directly from the Constitution, and they fall into several categories. Now, the first one is the military. One of the most important powers bestowed upon the president is the position of Commander-in-Chief. This position makes the president the chief military authority in the United States. This comes with control over the entire Department of Defense. As Commander-in-Chief, the President has the power to act as commander of the national military and state National Guard units when they are called into service. This power also places the President as the head of all of the nation's intelligence networks, the CIA, the FBI. However, this is one area where we see a crossover into inherent presidential power. This is because Congress declares war. However, presidents try to deploy the American military without congressional approval. We've seen this many times during the Nixon administration, during Reagan, the Bush administrations. All presidents have tried to do this at some point. Now, because of this, in response to Nixon's unilateralism in deploying troops in 1973, Congress passed the War Powers Resolution. This is a congressional resolution indicating that the President can send troops into action abroad only with congressional authorization, or if American troops are already under attack or serious threat. Presidents generally ignore the War Powers Resolution by claiming inherent executive power to defend the nation and send troops into action. Now, along with the military, there is a military sources of domestic power that we have to consider. Presidential military power extends to the domestic arena also. Now, this is where you have to consider the differences between foreign and domestic. Foreign means our military is overseas. They are on somebody else's soil. Domestic, of course, is in-house, right? It is within the U.S. borders or on a U.S. territory. Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution provides for the national government's protection of the states against invasion and domestic violence. Congress has gradually made this a presidential power under the Commander-in-Chief Clause to discharge these obligations. There is a huge limitation to this power, and that limitation is the President can only discharge this power at the state's request. The use of military powers by the President extends executive powers by making federal grants, insurance, and assistance available. So be aware that the President also has the ability to use the military within domestic borders, but only at the request of the states. Now, the next category is the judicial category. Now, this is the President's power to grant pardons and amnesties. Usually towards the end of a presidential term, you will see the then current president grant pardons and amnesties to various persons that they deem worthy, and these persons have to, of course, petition the president for these pardons. Now, another category is the diplomatic front. This is where the president is the U.S.'s head of state and chief representative in dealings with other nations. He is the face of the United States. Presidents can receive ambassadors and recognize other countries to enter treaties with them. In recent times, presidents have used executive agreements. Now, these are agreements made between the president and countries that have the force of a treaty, but do not require the Senate's advice and consent to bypass the Senate's approval. There are two types of executive agreements. One is the executive congressional agreement, submitted to a simple majority of congressional approval. The other type is the sole executive agreement between the president and a foreign state. Now, the next category is the actual executive power. Article 2, Section 2 gives the chief executive power to appoint, remove, and supervise all executive officers and appoint all federal judges. Appointment power makes the president the chief executive officer of the nation. Now, Section 3 of Article 2 stipulates that the president must see that all laws are faithfully executed. Another component of presidential power is executive privilege. This is the claim that confidential communications between a president and close advisors should not be revealed without the consent of the president. This type of secrecy is often used under a claim of national security protection. So next we have the president's legislative power. Now remember, Article 1 is Congress. So under Article 1, Section 7 and Article 2, Section 3, we find that the president has been given the power to participate in the legislative process. The first provision says the president shall from time to time give to Congress information of the state of the Union and recommend to their consideration such matters as he shall judge necessary and expedient. So every year or so, the president will go before the entirety of Congress and give a speech and let Congress know how the United States is doing according to the president, and what the president sees as the need to focus on specific issues. Now, the second provision is the veto power. This is the president's constitutional power to turn down acts of Congress. Now remember, a president's veto can be overturned by congressional vote. Okay, so 2/3, this is a supermajority vote from each chamber, can overturn a veto. So be sure you pay attention to these express powers, the categories, and also what each of the categories allows the president to do.